I'd like to talk about the larger aims of the book, The West, A New History, in the context first of the preface that you wrote. You start by saying that although there's never been a single, unified, easily defined place called the West, there is something that we can call the West that is a web of societies centered in Europe and its extensions, loosely linked by shared and interacting histories. Would you enlarge on this, on your ideas of the West and what it is?
Yeah, I think the West is not, for example, a single ethnically or nationally unified entity there, and it used once to be thought of in those terms, and we would not for a moment believe that. There's not much in common in genetic inheritance between the Greeks and, say, the British, who did a lot to revive some of the Greek forms of constitutional government in the 19th and 20th centuries. The West, but there are ways in which these societies are linked. They're partly linked by the transmission of texts and ideas. So the Romans, who are quite distinct from the Greeks in language and in their origins, learn to read Greek and take over from the Greeks vital books, which they then use in their own way. So the Greeks had pioneered this idea that to be a politically active citizen, you had to be able to speak. In a democracy, you had to be able to get up in public and speak persuasively and powerfully and eloquently. And the Romans, as they build their republic, which becomes larger and larger until it's the whole Italian peninsula and beyond, are not building a direct democracy, but they are building a system that has elections for many of its chief officials, in which poor as well as wealthy people are represented, and in which has law courts like the Greeks. And the Romans, too, have this faith in public speaking, and they translate from the Greeks and adapt the Greek ways of training people to be politically active. So this is the kind of history that you can see. You see these books and ideas in Greece, and then in Rome, and then in medieval city-states, and then in 18th century Britain and America, not being used exactly the same way because each society is different, but still providing what really is a kind of organic link in which each later society is taking vital ideas from the other, not peripheral or marginal ideas, but vital ideas that are central to the way that justice is done, that politics is conducted, that public life is organized.
I mean, you could say that Europe is a kind of palimpsest, to use it is a manuscript over which there have been accreted increasing, layer after layer of new texts, of new practices, but always itself. I think it's important that people in the West have always had a sense of themselves as part of traditions, not always the same tradition, and I think this is very important, often competing traditions, but always appealing to often a very ancient past. In the 19th and 20th centuries, one of the most important forces shaping Europe is nationalism. But nationalism is almost always based on an appeal to the past, often a mythical past. Our ancestors came out of the German forests and founded the German nation, and we have been the same ever since. Well, that's obviously a myth, but it's a very powerful myth. And what do they go back to for this myth? Well, they go back to a book written by Roman. They go back to Tacitus and his Germania, which was itself, partly simply a work of the imagination and partly based on, we're not even sure what it was based on. But they go back to it, and they took it as an example of what German qualities were, and they said, we are still true to these even today. Europeans have always, they feel this tradition. And then I think the West is also a place defined by the competition within it. Certainly one thing that Tony has emphasized a great deal is that Europeans have generally been bad at building, very large, very stable empires. They have certainly built very large colonial empires, although, as we see in the second volume, these are empires that actually, on an historical scale, didn't last very long. They didn't last anywhere near as long as the Roman Empire, as the Chinese Empire, as the Japanese Empire. They have... But what Europeans have done very well is to compete with each other, often, but in a way that with a common understanding between them. There were common stakes, there were common ideas, common things they were fighting over.